Everyone's in the room, right?
Thank you, Michelle. Hi, our managing editor of American Purpose. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jeff Gedman with American Purpose, and I am excited, thrilled really about this Zoom conversation today. We'll run 1 hour till 1 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to introduce the topic and our guests of honor in just a moment. I'm going to tell you for format that we will leave time for questions the last 15 minutes or so. However, as we go, put your questions and comments in chat. We'll read them, and as appropriate, I may call on this or that person or read a question out loud. That's the format. Hard stop, 1 p.m. Eastern. So you all, this is a pleasure and privilege because we've got lots, if I may say, we have plenty broken in our glorious system and culture of liberal democracy in the United States. And broadly speaking, from my point of view, broadly, you see a pattern that is ongoing and predates Donald J. Trump, by the way, of loosening voter ties to establishment parties and eroding trust in parts of the electorate in elites, broadly defined. One part of the problem is to diagnose and find out what needs to be healed or what requires surgery or reform or repair, if we may put it that way. But then this conversation also moves forward to what to do, what's practical, what's feasible, achievable, and I would say maximally impactful. And what a group we have to discuss this with us today. I introduced very briefly at the top, you have their bios, you know them actually. We have Peter Ackerman, who is an investor, I would say political innovator. Peter, I would call you a friend, a small D Democrat, a former chairman of the board of Freedom House. I'm going to hold up one of your publications, one of your books. If you don't have it, let us know and we'll procure a copy for you. It's called The Checklist in Tyranny, How Dissidents Will Win 21st Century Civil Resistance Campaigns. This is focused on international affairs and the support and defense of democracy abroad, but we're going to focus today principally on US domestic affairs. Then we have Katherine Gehl. And Katherine, thank you so much for being with us. You know her as a businesswoman and CEO. She was a board member of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation during the Obama administration. She has been involved in so many important efforts, from no labels to campaign to fix the debt. She's also a writer and book author. I'll note The Politics Industry, How Innovation Can Break Partisan Gridlock and Save Our Democracy. We're going to hear a lot more from her about her work in political innovation. And then Doug Schoen, who is a political advisor. He's advised Bill Clinton and Michael Bloomberg. He is the author of books and articles. I will note, Michelle, if you can find it, and my memory is bad, I looked it up yesterday. Check the Hill, October 31st, on strategies to salvage our democracies. It's very much relevant. And Doug's book, The End of Democracy, ? Russia and China on the Rise, America in Retreat. Welcome, Peter. Welcome, Katherine. Welcome, Doug. Here's what we're going to do, you all. We're going to hear from Doug for the first 10, 12 minutes or so about the mood and appetite of the American public for political reform, specifically about how we vote. We're going to turn to Katherine and talk about the innovative work she's doing. We're going to complete with hard, clear questions to Peter about this impactful feasibility basket of issues. But before we start, and before I ask Doug to kick us off, Peter, can you very succinctly give us a glossary? Because we're going to hear about things like Final Five voting. Maybe we'll leave that for Katherine. We're certainly going to talk about ranked choice voting. What in the world is that? Sounds like a political science seminar, but it's so important these days. Peter, we'll come back to you later, but could you give us the basic glossary of the terms we're likely to hear in the next 45, 50 minutes?
Certainly. Today, when we vote with what's called first past the post, plurality, winner take all voting, which means that if you have a multiplicity of candidates, more than two, who you can vote for one only, and whoever has the who has the plurality, sometimes it's a majority or the most votes, wins. So if you have 5 candidates, it's perfectly possible that somebody wins with 28% of the vote. Ranked choice voting, by contrast, is instead of having one vote as your political expression, you have a chance to rank all the candidates that are on the ballot in terms of your preference, and that the candidate with the least number of first place votes in the first runoff is dropped out. Those who held that candidate as number one, their number two becomes their number one, and there's another runoff and another drops out. And this process goes on, this instant runoff process goes on till you're down to the 2 left, and then you vote again and you end up with a majority winner.
Peter, that is a brilliant, succinct beginning. We will return to some of those terms. We'll put things in chat. And this is an experts roundtable. People will be familiar with most, if not all. But thank you, very helpful. Doug, could we go to you? You take us any which way you want, but the way I would like to propose is, here we are in an expert roundtable trying to fix things, but you are well acquainted with American voters and what they do think is broken, and what might they be inclined toward in terms of solutions or management of problems. But in any case, Doug, welcome. We're happy to hear from you.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me say a couple of things before I get specifically to the question you've asked. First, a sort of point of personal privilege, if you will, that I think informs the subject. I have been involved in, broadly speaking, reform activities probably going back 13, 14 years. Some with Peter, some with Catherine, some with Peter and Catherine, some on my own. I think it is fair to say, as a summary of 14 years, it ain't easy. Put another way, the one thing that I like to joke that the two parties agree on is the need to keep outsiders out and to keep the system from offering the opportunity for greater uncontrolled and unanticipated participation. So that would be point one. Point two, I would really underscore, Jeff, something that you said. It would be very useful for those who are viewing this to get Catherine's book on politics that you referenced and Peter's on nonviolent civil disobedience, which I referenced in my October 31st Hill article, simply because these are two profound thinkers and doers in American political life in a space that I can tell you has very, very few people of their stature, intellect, and accomplishment working as assiduously as they are. So that would be point two. Point three, turning to your question, is I think a threshold issue that we have to be aware of that came out of the last presidential election. Before you get to the issue of how you fix the system, I think we need to acknowledge that for those that voted for Donald Trump, 60, 65%, some percentage around there, believe that the election was stolen. We've never had, in my experience, and I go back, I think, to the 1960 election, which I don't think we're here to talk about, but we could do that. But I don't think going back to the 1960 election, we've had an election that has been as fraught with suspicion, peril, uncertainty as to its credibility. And I think that has calamitous implications. And I pass no judgment on any of the allegations to say nothing was demonstrated in a court of law to the satisfaction of some 30 or 40 individual judges to raise questions about the ultimate outcome, notwithstanding the allegations and notwithstanding the tragic events of January 6th. But what I think it is fair to say that runs across the political divide is that there is a great deal of dissatisfaction and suspicion with a system that is perceived to be increasingly controlled by special interests, big money, and to be one that, for a variety of reasons, facilitates the exercise of power by highly motivated extreme partisans. I think it's also the case that there is a lack of competition. There's a lack of choice in the system, and outsiders are blocked from participation. That I can tell you firsthand, that we have crippling division, and we have really a democracy that, generally speaking, is broken. We will get to the issue of ranked choice, but rest assured, Peter's definition was a good one. The problem we have is it is a difficult issue to introduce in communications to voters, something that Peter and Catherine are individually and collectively working on as we speak and as we talk. But I think what voters want from a ranked choice system, once they hear about it, is more power, more access, more freedom. They want the opportunity to create broader coalitions, and they want the opportunity to fix our democracy to make it arguably more representative and closer to the design of the framers. And indeed, when we look at ranked choice, voters want to make elections more competitive, to give people more choice and freedom, to support coalition building, to bring to bear the full scope of views and interests that people have, and to make it, broadly speaking, more representative. I would tell you, since the system itself, the first past the post system, at this point is not broadly discredited. People have doubts about it, but depending on the jurisdiction, it's fair to say that we're not dealing with a system itself that in and of itself is immediately perceived as suspect. The communications requires explaining to people how the current system can and should be enhanced. Some states more or less support for that, and that goes into the difficult decisions that Peter and Catherine have made respectively about where to put the resources that they bring to bear for political change. And there is a sense that the more closed a primary election is, the more difficult it is. Open primaries do better than closed primaries, but I think it's fair. The greater the degree of openness there is in a system, the more the electorate will respond to that. More generally, Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents have responded better to reform initiatives than have Republicans, though in some instances, certainly the effort that Catherine sponsored and facilitated in Maine, but for Republicans supporting it, there would not have been a successful outcome. And as we go forward, I think it's fair to say that we need a national narrative, a national conversation about how to change our system, because regardless of what kind of precise or specific changes one might advocate, I think it's fair to say we have a system now, given what happened in 2020 and indeed 2016, that was perilously close to breaking down in ways we never would have anticipated. And going forward to 2022 and 2024, I think there are question marks about our democracy that Peter and Catherine, in singular and very, very important ways are addressing, and I would only commend the audience to follow and support their efforts, because these are two of the leading, as I said, advocates, thinkers, and most importantly, effective doers in a limited space, which is the reform space. So let me stop there and turn it back to Jeff. I'll take a few questions if there are any, but hopefully that's a useful answer to your first question.
Well, it's an incredibly useful start, Doug. Thank you. I'm going to take the liberty of asking one question, which undoubtedly will continue with you, Catherine, in a moment. And by the way, to Doug and Catherine, apologies. I held up Peter's book because I have a physical copy of it. But you know, these days, one does not always have physical copies of the wonderful things that you all write, but your books are in chat and I commend them to everybody. Catherine, if you can grab one off the shelf, feel free. Do you have one handy there? There we are. Hold it up. It's incredibly useful to do that. Politics industry. Thank you. Thank you. You're muted.
I have Doug's books as well, but I could get distracted looking for them in here.
Don't worry. Don't worry. My apologies, but they're in chat, and thank you for the look at that. So Doug, the question I want to ask you before we go on to Catherine, who can also take a crack at this. We've started with a glossary and definitions and what is ranked choice voting. That in and of itself suggests to me, let's say, a challenge if we're trying to create, as you put it, Doug, a national narrative. You know, in the battle of hearts and minds, I always say, hearts come first. And so to arouse the passion of the people with the start of a glossary and definitional questions in and of itself is a problem to tackle, I suggest. But to you, Doug, specifically or more broadly, you brought it up. What are the things we need to think about to create a national narrative around the kinds of reforms that you think are appropriate right now?
And again, I commend people, particularly Catherine's book, which I can tell you, and this may be about the best praise I could give someone else's work. She describes the business I have been in for the better part of 40, 45 years. And the reason why I have been drawn to the reform space, because as an industry, the people who are involved with politics and political consulting are tethered to a system that is both sclerotic, unresponsive, and ineffective. And what we needed, I would say, is a conversation about why that is the case and what we need to do about it so that we can get on to then how we go about changing it. Because the politics industry as an industry, and I suspect Catherine would agree with this, has as a vested interest and highest possible goal trying to keep people like Catherine and Peter out of it because they have a economic and political interest in keeping the system just as unresponsive, just as exclusive as it proves to be. So I believe we need a national conversation about the whole need for reform, need for ranked choice, and what will be the benefits that will accrue to an ordinary citizen. Why should somebody care about this? And why will this make a meaningful impact on their lives?
So Doug, thank you very much. I want to watch the clock. If you're available to stick with us, I know you have a tough schedule today. We may well return to you, but Catherine, let's go to you and pick up from where Doug took us, left off, about changes. Could you talk to us a little bit about proposed changes? And I'm going to jump in and right now ask you, tell us also compared to what? Because a number of reform ideas have been and are on the table, and you're very clear in your work about what is most impactful in your view, and also what is most feasible, achievable. Catherine, please.
Jeff, thank you. And it was good to hear from Doug and good to be here with Peter as well. So let me, before I answer that question exactly, step back for a moment to say, and let me just throw out, better representation is what I would call the Booby Prize of political reform. And here's why. Yes, people want to be well represented, and they want to feel that their votes resulted in representation. But what people really want the world over is results that have them believe that their children's lives are going to be better than theirs. They want results more than they want representation. And this is what we see when democracies fail, is people are reaching for results and they end up trading representation. And then later they'll find out that without representation, you won't have representation or results. But in the meantime, they're willing to give up representation. So our challenge as a democracy is how to find representation and deliver that promise in our Constitution, while also having those representing us delivering the results that keep people satisfied with the system of government that they are in. And when we think about reform, a lot of times the only thing we're talking about is representation, and whether it's fair, and whether it's democratic, and whether it is auditable, and whether it has integrity. And what we need to be thinking about also is whether those elections, which is where we hire the people who represent us, put those people who are hired in a position to deliver results. And we just miss that piece of the puzzle all the time. So what I'm saying is that how we elect people right now, the biggest problem is not who wins. The problem is what those winners can and cannot do. So we need to choose people, hire them in a way that once they're hired, they can actually do that which needs doing, which is solve complex problems and deal with complex trade-offs in a way that we can move the country forward, even though we're divided. So that's why what I work on really sort of singularly is a system called Final Five voting, which has ranked choice voting as a key piece of it. If we change how we elect people, how they get their jobs by Final Five voting, we will not only have representative winners, but we'll have people who are in a position to do the job well. So first, what we should do is get rid of party primaries. And instead of party primaries, we would have a single first round election, and you go to the polls, everybody running is on the same ballot, every voter votes in the same, on those same choices, no matter whether they're Democrat, Republican, Independent. Polls close, count the votes, the top 5 finishers advance to the general election. This does one thing immediately. It means that we don't know who wins after the primary. We're going to have to actually wait until everybody turns out in November to know who wins. And when those voters turn out in November, they'll see 5 people. And now we use ranked choice voting. So now the voters go to the polls, they see their 5 choices, they rank them all the way from their favorite, oh, please God, let it be Peter Ackerman, he would be the best senator ever, all the way down to, sort of their 5th choice, oh, I really, don't want that Katherine Gehl, so she's my last choice. Let me just say then the polls close, we enter this series of instant runoffs, which is what ranked choice voting is, a series of instant runoffs. And then we emerge with the winner being the person who has the broadest support among the most number of voters. So it's representative for sure. And the general election made the decision instead of the primary voters. But here's the key point. People hired in that system now get to Washington, D.C. with the freedom and the incentive to negotiate, to deal make, to legislate, to create solutions that will appeal to a broad section of general election voters. And even in red districts, there are Democrats. Even in blue districts, there are Republicans. the general election voter makes up what we call an exhausted majority. That's a major, political study these days, the exhausted majority. And now our elected representatives will be answering to those voters, not just a narrow slice of party primary voters. So the actions they can take are entirely different. And that's what we really need out of our system, is not change who wins, but change what the winners have the freedom to do and what they're incented to do.
So, Katherine, thank you. Can you tell me what you propose? Is there argument to be made that these ideas and final five voting favors one party over the other?
Yeah, so final five voting, well, first of all, I wouldn't be doing it if it was a Trojan horse for partisan advantage, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why reform tends to have a bad name, not because reform doesn't often have good aims, but because usually people invest in reform because they actually think it's going to help their side more than the other side. So this is the first effort where it really is not going to help one more than the other. I talk about it as being a free market politics. It helps the competition. It helps the customers. Now, I think that one of the reasons we are likely to be successful over time with this change to final five voting is because it benefits both sides or hurts them both equally, but also mostly because it benefits the citizens, the customers. And here's the thing that I would differ with Doug a little bit about. The politics industry is a totally anti-competitive industry right now. That's certainly true. And when you have anti-competitive industries, dysfunctional competition, then customers aren't well served. That's the premise of my book. But once we execute this change to move to final five voting, you will still have a politics industry, and there will still be people in the business of politics, and they will still make money. But the difference will be is that now the best way to win in the business of politics will now be by serving the customers, meaning the citizens writ large, versus the current system. The best way to win in the business of politics is by serving special interests and the 10% of voters that vote in partisan primaries and serving donors. So you still have a vibrant political industry. It's just that when industries work in competition, like in a capitalist, well-regulated, capitalist environment, the business does well and the customers do well. And that's what we need to do from political innovation.
So I'm going to indulge myself. I'm going to ask one more before I call on colleague Ben Weeks from the gallery who has a question about primaries. But before we go there, you've said a couple times or so, Katherine, customers. And it seems to me, voter, customer, we, the people, depend on simplicity and clarity. And there are bunches of reform ideas and issues out there and have been. What you're driving forward, are these things mutually exclusive? How do you talk to us about other reform initiatives, campaign finance, redistricting? What's the primer for me, the voter, to understand what you're advocating, how it compares to what and why?
So I think, whenever you run an organization, it's really good to know what you're good at, but it's mostly good to know what you're not good at. And what I am not good at is figuring out how to make any of this appeal to a voter in a 30-second commercial. So we have, in this effort to change to final five voting, communications, political campaign experts who will determine what is the message that goes to voters who get to choose yes or no for final five voting. I do not, have those messages. And that's one of the reasons Peter and I have both worked with Doug Schoen, for example, because he is a message diviner, so he can help us figure those out. Now, what I will say, though, is for groups like this, where we have the longer conversation, there is something important to distinguish, which is the second part of your question. Why final five voting instead of other reforms, campaign finance or term limits, or I can't remember what other ones you were bringing up, but electoral college, for example. And here's where that comes from my background as a business person. I'm only interested in things that we can get done in our lifetimes, which is to say, I don't think it's helpful to talk about things that, if we could get them done, would powerfully change the system if we can't get them done. So for the same reasons that our system is, that our country is so divided right now, those are reasons that keep us from being able to pass any constitutional amendment. So I wouldn't want to work right now on something that we would need a constitutional amendment to change, which, for example, we would need for term limits, which, for example, we would need for changing the electoral college, which, for example, we would need for much of campaign finance. So I just say, oh, can't be done in our lifetime, so put those aside. And then the second thing is we need to look at things that, if we achieved them, would be likely to change the likelihood that Congress starts to deliver results in the public interest, which is say we have to be able to change it, but changing it has to be worth it. It has to be powerful enough. And for that, I have a different litmus test, which is I think of us as drowning right now, like sort of we're drowning in our democracy. And the only things I want to recommend to people or work on are things that, if we're successful, get the water to at least here. We have to be able to breathe and keep our heads above water while we do all the other important work, which is to say final five voting is nowhere near the only thing we need to care about or worry about in our democracy. It's just the sine qua non. We have to do it first to keep our heads above water, and then we can work on every additional piece. But in the meantime, what we should not do is invest time in things that make us feel better, make our democracy seem more fair, more democratic, et cetera, if the water is still above our heads. We have to live to breathe another day.
Enormously helpful. Peter, we're just about to go to you. However, Catherine, let's continue. Let's take a question in chat from colleague Ben Weeks. In each case, when I call on someone, if you'd like to keep it in chat, I'll read it. But Ben, if you'd like the floor, we'd like to offer that to you. And in all cases, please identify yourself. Ben, if you can hear me, would you like to pose your question? You also have a definitional footnote question, if I may put it that way. Ben?
Yes, thank you. I guess everybody can probably read my question in chat, but for those that are on telephone or whatnot, I'll read it very, very briefly. It says, for Catherine, a question you may answer later, but how would you propose to do away with party primaries? The partisan backlash from both sides looks to be extreme. Where does the matching passion come from? And Catherine, I think you addressed that. You addressed that pretty well. It looks like that probably the logical place at the logical initiative is probably public referendum. And but I do think that the backlash is from both the Democrats and Republicans, particularly in those jurisdictions where it is this sort of reform is most needed. The most firmly entrenched. Here in Colorado, where I come from, we're already relatively open to a little bit more embracing election process. I'm curious, as you did mention, and I appreciate your comment about you need some messaging people, and that Doug may be one of the champions of that. I think that's great. Do you have people lined up to actually take this in the next election cycle?
Thank you, Ben, for your question. So you are right. One of the most promising ways to make this change to final five voting is to use a public referendum in the approximately half the states that have that opportunity. So final five voting actually is already not a theory, Alaska passed Final Five voting by public referendum in November of 2020. And they passed it for all of their federal delegation as well as their state legislature and all statewide offices. So we will see, and my organization works on public referendums, we'll see 3 to 4 states have this on the ballot in November of 2022. And in those states, those campaigns, we consult with them, we help get them started, but they are run locally, meaning in that state, as they should be. And they all will have their individual messages, and we have experts, that are engaged in those nascent campaigns already. So they will be the ones who figure out the messages to get it across the finish line. Now, the next thing I will note, however, is that we do also have legislative campaigns. So for example, in my original home state of Wisconsin, we founded a campaign for Final Five voting in 2017. And and in April of this last year, we had bipartisan legislation for Final Five voting introduced in our state legislature with a lead sponsor of a conservative rising star Republican and the second co-sponsor, a liberal rising star, Democrat, and then again, 22 other co-sponsors. We have a completely bipartisan team, and that legislation is moving right along. So you can do it legislatively when you reach agreement with everybody that Washington is broken. And that is one thing that people across the entire spectrum agree on here in this country still. Everybody still agrees on that. So when you go in with that message, I think it's actually much more probable to get the legislative change than people would have assumed. The final thing I'll note is that everybody originally assumes that, quote, the parties will not be for this. And I want to harken back to something I said a moment ago. This politics industry is going to exist, and it should exist. We need people in the business of politics, and people who will run, and people who will make the policies, and the think tanks and the advertisers and consultants, all of that. There's nothing wrong with all of those people being strong and doing well, as long as they're only doing well if the public, the voters, the citizens are doing well. So there's something wrong when 90% of people disapprove of Congress, and yet the industry's doing well. But it would be perfectly fine if the players in the industry were doing well, if 90% of citizens thought they were doing a great job, right? Because that's how it works in our for-profit industries. The companies that serve the customers the best are the ones that get to be the strongest, and they reap the benefits of that. And that is how competition works. So we have dysfunctional competition, and the people doing the best are not the ones doing the best jobs for us. But as soon as we change that, you can have strong parties, which we should have. I'm a huge fan of strong parties. And you can have strong results for the citizens. The last piece I'll note about that is, here's a problem. Let's imagine you're running a company and someone else gets to choose your products for you. And that's the position the parties are currently in. The product that they need to go to the mat for in the general election is chosen for them in a primary, which is why when you talk to insiders and parties all the time, sometimes they say, well, if we get a good candidate out of the primary, if we get the candidate we want on the primary, we can win in the general. They don't actually even control their own product in that sense. So there's actually opportunities for parties to do better, but only by serving customers better once you have Final Five voting.
So Catherine, thank you. And Ben, thank you very much. Catherine.
Great answer, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben and Catherine. So Catherine, don't go anywhere. We're coming back to you, but I want to bring Peter Ackerman into the conversation. And Peter, I want to get a little conversation going with you in just a moment with Frank DeStefano, who has put something in chat. Frank wrote for us recently on how to construct a new political party. We had Philip Howard recently in American Purpose on Andrew Yang's effort. And Frank, you will moderate for us Andrew Yang later this month on November 30th, 12 noon. Peter, what do we actually want? Do we need a third party, or do we need a path to enable unaffiliated candidates to compete? And A or B, what role for ranked choice voting?
Thanks for all the great commentary to this moment. I believe it's the latter. I don't believe this country will accept over the long term a third party that has all the facilities the other two do, including creating a common platform, creating a loyalty structure that basically brings in resources over many election cycles. What I think people do want is a pathway for unaffiliateds, which could have a party affiliation or just be completely independent, that can compete on a level playing field against the two major parties. And that is where I think our focus should be. When we talk about a third party, it's sort of like a throwaway idea where people say, geez, the Democrats and Republicans are really not serving us. We need a third party. But when they say third party, before they actually think about what's needed to construct one, they're really saying we need something else, some other set of choices that the public has access to and that are viable competitors for. Not too long ago, about a year and a half ago, my colleague Kara McCormick and I commissioned with others a 50,000 member poll, and we asked a very simple question. Would you like to see someone on the ballot that's not a Democrat or Republican that can have a competitive pathway to come to office? Of all voters that were female, 68.5% said yes, 31.5% said no. 69% of the males said yes, and 31% said no. But of all voters below the age of 40, 79% yes, and 21% said no. Now, there's nothing wrong with the third party. The problem with the third party is that it tends to base itself on the assumption that every voter is easily placed on a continuum of opinion that's expressed only by their preference, but not necessarily by their intensity of preference. So when we talk about third parties, we mostly are talking about centrist third parties, which in the last 5 or 10 years, several people have tried, but have failed to create the critical mass to get there. Because of the complexity of voters really have two dimensions. They have their preference and their intensity of preference. So Jeff, let's say you and I had 10 issues and we agreed on all 10, but of those issues, your intensity of dislike for Donald Trump might be at 100 and mine might be at 50, but your intensity of opposition to, let's say, the Build Back Better reconciliation bill might be at 50 and mine might be at 100. In a two-party choice or even the third-party choice, we might actually agree but vote for two different kinds of candidates. What an unaffiliated candidate can do, if it's given a pathway, is basically capture at that moment on a bespoke basis the views of the majority of American voters that are most intensely felt at that time. So I believe, to summarize, that a third party is not going to be a successful alternative, but a pathway for independence to compete on a level playing field will be, and in my opinion, is vital to the successful development of our political life in this country. So let me just spend a second and explain why I believe that's the case. If you look at any enterprise in this country, it could be corporate, it could be eleemosynary, it could be government. Everybody in that enterprise wants to move the enterprise forward in terms of it being more useful to society. And what you'll find in that enterprise is people who think we should go one way, people who think we should go another, people maybe go a third, but they always, but these organizations and enterprises that are successful find a way to synthesize those various opinions and take steps in a progressive, in a direction that speaks progress. What we have today with two dominant parties is we have a thesis, we have an antithesis, and we have no prospect for creating synthesis. As a matter of fact, the system is constructed so that there is negative incentive to create synthesis. So for example, yesterday, Leon Panetta was on public broadcasting in the Sunday morning shows, and he made a point that one of the problems with our political life today is a lack of leadership. And my feeling is, no, there's plenty of wonderful people who can lead. But what we have is skewed incentives, so wonderful people are not allowed to lead. They're forced into directions that if they really had the choice and the fluidity of choices, they would lead very differently. So I think it's vital that we create this competitive pathway for the unaffiliated. It may evolve a party, but it may not. But the idea that it's all going to be compressed into a third party, I don't believe is what is going to happen.
So you all, I look and say, good heavens, we have 12 and a half minutes left. I want to get Frank in. I want to get Arch Puddington in. I just have to sandwich in one quick question, Peter, if there's a quick answer. For unaffiliated candidates, when and how do they develop the organizational capacities to compete with the two dominant parties? Is that a question in your mind?
Well, yes, but let me just answer a question before that. Can either a third party or an unaffiliated candidate base survive without replacing first past the post voting with ranked choice voting? The answer is absolutely not. Ranked choice voting, and of course, Final Five as a part of that, is, I think, a prerequisite to either of them developing. Now, the question you're asking is, how does an organization develop quickly to create the name recognition and the organizational power and the resource gathering to actually put a third party candidate, or more likely an unaffiliated candidate, repeatedly over the line? In my experience, through another initiative called Americans Elect, we went out and gathered a record number of signatures around the country. And right behind the signature, where we stopped and asked people, would you like to vote for a candidate that's neither Democrat or Republican that could run for president? We have nearly 3 million people said yes. And right behind that, almost spontaneously, in every state Democrat, in every state assembly district that we operated in, there came spontaneously developed an organization prepared to support that candidate. I think that over several election cycles, people will innovate when they get used to the idea of Final Five and ranked choice voting. They'll begin to innovate so that candidates that don't have party affiliation can quickly create some of the things that parties seem to be the only capable of creating now. We have inklings of this when we look at Christmas. Look at how many people are being hired just for the Christmas season. The massive number of employees that are coming to the retailers, and they're hired within months and become useful within months and then disband. So with innovation, I'm sure that they will, and a few election cycles, will be able to create a pathway that's just as competitive as the two parties. But until we get rid of first past the post, which creates the spoiler that makes it impossible for a third to run without being considered a spoiler, nothing is going to get done.
So Peter, thank you. Let's hear from Frank. Let's hear from Arch, and then we'll go back to Peter and Catherine. But Frank, you have the floor.
Hey, so, listening to all this and, all this debate that we've been having about ranked choice voting. So the big question, there's one conceptual thing and a big question that I keep coming back to. The conceptual thing is this assumption that we need a third party instead of a new party. And the phrase that I always use is a new party, because it's not the same thing. Because I don't necessarily think the goal needs to be having a multi-party system. The goal needs to be refreshing our political parties to rebuild a new coalition with fresh ideas that's capable of a compelling message that could bind a new majority into the future, and very likely replacing one of the parties that we have now. And it's in that the focus on a third party is sort of misplaced, because the assumption is that the Democrats and the Republicans and liberalism and conservatism are permanent in American life, and that we need to somehow shoehorn something else in. And I don't believe that's true. I think they're temporary and we can change them, and we've changed them plenty of times over history, and we will again. Which then gets back to this whole question of ranked choice voting, which is the theory of it, as I understand it when I listen to it, is that the core problem that people believe is affecting American democracy right now and affecting our republic and is stopping reform is this structural problem. There's an assumption that there is this group of compelling people with great ideas that can bind a new majority and can solve all the new problems of the post-industrial world. And they're just waiting out there in the wings, and they're being locked out of a system due to structural problems. And if we reduce the structural problems, these people will be able to rush into the public square and start solving problems. But what if that's not the problem? What if the problem is the ideological and cultural work that has to be done? What if we, all of us who want reform, who are looking at these new problems and want solutions, haven't done the core work that always has to be done to build a party of building a compelling message, being able to come up to America and say, we recognize here's what's wrong with America. We have some solutions. We have a take on it, you know, not a bunch of white papers, policy white papers, like a compelling message. And without that, if you fix the structural problem and you don't have that, those people will not be there to rush into the space and to reform the system. So that's, I know I don't have a lot of time, so I'd love to hear a response to that.
So Frank, thank you. Now I'm going to interrupt rudely and say, before Peter and Catherine reply,
Yeah.
let's invite Arch to jump in. Arch,
Sure.
if you're there, you had two questions. You get one, not the one about foreign policy. That's
Right.
another day, another time with Peter, but yours about New York experience and possible emerging problems. Arch, you have the floor.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So I live in New York, and we had a very interesting experience with ranked choice voting in the Democratic primaries for mayor and other city offices. And in the mayor's race, we had the first round. Eric Adams was ahead by about 10 percentage points at the end of the first round. There was a second round. Eric Adams won by less than a percentage point. It was very, very close. Katherine Garcia, the runner-up, was very gracious. She conceded, no problem. But what struck me is that in the environment that the political environment in the United States today, a situation like that, where a Katherine Garcia would have beaten Eric Adams in the second round, could have led to the kind of horrible situation that we have today, with Trump denying that he lost the election and so on and so forth. And I'm just wondering if our guests have a comment about that potential situation, raising questions about the credibility of ranked choice voting.
So Arch, thank you. I'm going to give Peter the first crack. Catherine, you will have the final words, plural, and remind you all, this is not our last conversation. So you don't have to squeeze it all in now, but we're open and eager. Peter, you have the floor.
Well, first of all, hi, Arch. Arch is an
Peter.
old colleague and friend. Remember, that was ranked choice voting within a party with skewed voting. So we're talking about ranked choice voting that would be used along for every American. And I think the problems that basically emerged, I'm not sure it is a problem because the same guy won at the end, that emerged within a party context, an individual contained party context, would be extrapolatable to an election in which there is Democrats, Republicans, Independents operating and voting at the same time. I have more to say about that, but I'm under Jeff's constraint, so I'll stop there.
Peter, thank you. Catherine, over to you, please.
Okay, I will also choose what I can delve into given the time. So Frank, I agree with you that a third party is not the answer that people think it is. And I therefore also agree with Peter Ackerman, who, by the way, I would never have discovered ranked choice voting if it hadn't been for Peter Ackerman and Kara McCormick, who's also on the line. So I owe them every day a debt of gratitude. But here's what we need to understand about competition in any industry, and this is true in politics. What I say all the time is our problem is not the Democrats or the Republicans or or political parties or the fact that we have only two. Our problem is that the current two are guaranteed to remain the only two ongoingly, regardless of what they do or don't get done on behalf of the citizens who are voting for them. So 3 doesn't make it work. 5 doesn't make it work. There's no number that makes it work. It's whether those number are competing to solve problems for general election voters, or whether they're competing on some other basis, like to get the most donations, or they're competing to get the time on Fox News or MSNBC. They're competing on the wrong dimensions right now. So when we change the dimension of competition to be to get a majority in the general elections in November, instead of to win this 10% of voters in red districts or this 10% of voters in blue districts, then people will do different things. And so here's the second point of this. Competition doesn't have to change who wins to change the results. It's the threat of new competition in capitalist, in competitive systems that drives behavior that may not result in a win for a new company or a new innovator, but still results in wins for innovation in the system and for the customers. So that's what we need in our election system. So you could have someone who runs and they run on an innovative new economic policy and they don't win, but they influence the behavior and the policy choices and the policy dialogue. And then the winners actually end up adopting some of that, which is to say, remember, I would tell you that this whole focus on who's winning and that we have to unleash all these great new people to run is a myth. If you took every single person and you kept them the same, but you changed all of their incentives today in Congress, you would have the same people and they would do different things. Because the way they were going to get reelected the next time would be by needing to appeal not to a narrow percent and a small portion of the electorate who decides in their primary, it would be to appeal to those general election voters. You would have over half of the people in Congress making entirely different decisions, and they would be the same people.
Jeff, may I make a point?
Peter, do so briefly.
Catherine got to the essence of the whole thing. It's not whether we have two parties, but it's the impossibility of a third competing that is allowing the two parties, Frank, to basically minimize the innovation that's needed for our country. So Catherine, I think, has summarized perfectly what this session should be about. We need the viable possibility of a third in whatever format that is in every election, and you will create the kinds of solutions that you're looking for more practically than if we have two parties that basically let no light in from a third.
Okay, you all, we are 1 p.m. Eastern on the dot. We do our level best to be respectful of your time and keep everybody on schedule. To Guy, John, and others in chat, it shows we had a warm-up period. Now we could stay an extra hour, but we won't today, and we'll have this illustrious group back again soon. Thanks, Catherine, for the shout out to Kara. She co-authored something recently with Peter for us, American Purpose, on ranked choice voting. Doug had to excuse himself for a meeting. I thank Doug. Catherine, Peter, splendid. This was illuminating. It was interesting and, dare I even say, exciting. Such serious people working to manage these very critical problems. So thank you. We're privileged for your time spent with us today. To all of you, you have a lot of Zooms to attend. To all of you, thanks so much for your time. Have a great afternoon, evening, and see you again soon. Thanks, everybody.
You're muted, Catherine.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, American Purpose. It's a pleasure.
Thanks,
to be here.
colleagues. Thanks, Catherine, Peter, everybody. Bye.
Good to have you, Peter and Catherine. Thank you.
Bye.
Arch, if you're still on, hello again. Thanks, Jeff, a great deal. I hope people found value in what we had to say.
Jeff must have left, but
Okay.
I will relay what you said. And it was a highly engaging and engaged audience. So
Great. Thanks so
chat.
much.
We'll do it again. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.